very pleased to welcome Danny Dilks to join us. Danny did his training, his PhD training at Johns Hopkins before a postdoc at MIT, correct?
Correct.
And then joined us here in Atlanta at Emory, where he's appointed to the faculty in psychology. Very pleased to have him here today and telling about his work trying to understand vision in biology and how that all happens. So thanks very much for joining us.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Chris, for the invitation, and thank you all for coming to the talk today. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. So today I'm going to talk about scene recognition, how and why. And that'll become clear exactly what I mean by that in a moment. But before diving into the how and why of scene recognition, I'd like to take a step back and tell you more generally what my lab is interested in. So my lab asks three big questions about human vision. The first is, how do we visually perceive people, places, and things, those classes of stimuli that are crucial for our survival? I think we'd all argue for that. The second is, how do these abilities get wired up in development? So talking to the age-old philosophical question of what kind of knowledge we come to the world with, as opposed to what kind of knowledge we get through experience. And the third question we look at in the lab is, once we're all wired up, how does the visual system change in adulthood? Now, today I'm not going to talk about question 2 or 3. And I'd be happy to come back and do that at another time, and instead focused on how we visually perceive, and zooming in a little bit more, as you could guess from the title, how we perceive places or scenes. Now, when we, or I, or any of us embark on any research question, I think the fundamental and first question we should ask is, who even cares about this topic? Why is it a topic worthy of study? Well, I think that scene recognition, or my ability to understand how we perceive places or scenes, is worthy of study for 3 reasons. The first reason is that scenes are special. Now, what exactly does that mean? First, it means that we are great at recognizing places and navigating through them. You walked into this room and immediately recognized that it was a classroom. You may have seen it before, but even if you hadn't, you'd still be able to recognize it within a fraction of a second, that it's a classroom and not a kitchen, for example. Second, you can use that visual information nearly simultaneously to navigate through this environment, not bumping into walls or feeling walls to get into the place, and avoiding obstacles. So we do all of this flawlessly, accurately, and really damn fast. The second reason scenes are special and why we should care about how we recognize scenes is that there are distinct cognitive signatures associated with them, or behavioral signatures associated with them. And distinct meaning that it's different than the ability that we have to recognize objects and faces. I'll unpack these a little bit more so you get a little clearer sense in just a moment. The third reason why scenes are special is that there's dedicated neural hardware associated with scene recognition, and again, distinct from the neural hardware that we use to recognize objects and faces. So scenes are special. First reason why this should be a topic worthy of study. The second reason is that understanding our ability to recognize scenes addresses fundamental questions regarding the organization of mind and brain. So the question of what kinds of functions are domain specific and what kinds are not, or what are then domain general. And the third reason why we should care about scene recognition is that it has major implications for our understanding of the computations underlying cognition. So if we properly understand the system, at least the way the human does it, the human system, we should be able to reverse engineer and make a system such that it behaves like an adult. So then understanding how we recognize scenes, if we want to build that machine, that model would be very different if scene processing would have to also incorporate our ability to recognize objects or faces, or it's a system in and of itself. So for these 3 reasons, I am interested in scene recognition, and hope by the end of this talk I will convince you that it's also important to study. I told you I'll unpack these first 3 here. So we're great at recognizing and navigating scenes. Let me just give you a sense of how great you are at it. You are going to see a number of pictures presented quite briefly, about 50 milliseconds. And they are going to be pictures of scenes, faces, and objects. And at the end, you're just going to call out and tell me how many pictures of a place did you see. It's going to go fast. How many pictures of a place did you see? 1, 2, good. What? 4. It's not 4. You come to the lab, I'm going to study you. This is fantastic. It's in fact 2. And the majority of you, I suppose, said 2. Some said 1. The point of this demonstration is to show that you can, in fact, recognize scenes rather quickly. If I asked you to recognize or tell me how many objects, you're as fast at doing that as you are at scenes, and the same thing for faces. So that's kind of cool. That's telling us that the scenes were, in fact, made up of a bunch of objects. So you are able to recognize the scene not as a compilation of objects, because that would have taken you longer than recognizing a single object. So that tells you that this is somewhat distinct from object recognition. But again, you're really quick at picking out pictures of scenes within this stream of pictures. The second thing is, of those people that said 2, or even of 1, was there anything about the scene? What kind of scene did you see, or place did you see? Can anybody? A house? A beach, indeed, that's true. So 1 was a house, and 1 was a beach with a boardwalk. So not only in those 50 milliseconds are you able to discriminate a picture of a scene from other things, you're able to get much richer information as well. Now, there's recent evidence out of Molly Potter's lab that we can actually do this not in 50 milliseconds, 50, but in as little as 13 milliseconds, which is pretty crazy. Okay, we have distinct cognitive signatures separate from object and scene, so I just alluded to that, saying that you're able to recognize a compilation of objects, if you will, called a place, meaning that it can't just be a compilation. But here's another, Lena.
Just to clarify,
sure.
When you say 13 milliseconds, you mean for a presentation
yes.
version of 13 milliseconds, but then it takes a while to
Exactly, exactly, yep. Okay. So here is an example of a distinct cognitive signature associated with scene recognition. So this is one example that Aude Oliva and Antonio Torralba had talked about that they called GIST. And their claim is that with a very degraded image with little to no object information, if you will, or at least not sharp and crisp, people are really accurate at identifying what kind of place it is. So for example, in this degraded image, if I asked you whether this was a kitchen, beach, or a street, well, let's do it. Raise your hand if you think this is a kitchen. Raise your hand if you think it's a beach. Raise your hand if you think it's a street. So you are like 3,000 other people that Aude and Antonio had tested in such a degraded image. People overwhelmingly say it's a street. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to unblur it and actually show you what objects are underneath of it. And what we have done here, what Aude and Antonio have done here, is they've superimposed a kitchen on a street. And what they found interesting about this is that no one in this degraded image would ever call this a kitchen. Why not? Right? Okay. And finally, there is dedicated neural hardware for scene recognition. So in the late 90s, Russell Epstein and Nancy Kanwisher discovered a region in and around the parahippocampal gyrus and lingual gyrus that they coined the parahippocampal place area. Some years later, Eleanor Maguire talked about a region in and around this retrosplenial cortex she called the retrosplenial complex, or RSC. And some 12 years later, I found a region in occipital cortex that we coined occipital place area. So these are the 3 regions that we know of thus far that are sans the hippocampus and subcortical things that we consider to be scene selective, or dedicated neural hardware for scene processing. Now, when I'm saying scene selective, I am talking about it in the following way. If I put each and every one of you in a magnet right now, in a scanner right now, and showed you images of pictures of places like this versus any kind of everyday objects or faces, and contrasted the images of the places to the everyday objects or the faces, I would find in nearly every one of you these 3 scene-selective regions. So these regions respond about 2 to 4 times more to images of scenes than they do the other image categories. So a huge effect size and reliable across subjects and many, many, many labs. Okay, so that's cool, but who cares? So what? We have dedicated scene-selective cortex. That's a nice step, but it tells us nothing. So the big question is, why do we have these dedicated pieces of tissue? In other words, or I can answer that question by asking then, what are the representations and computations underlying scene processing? And I can go into those regions of interest and ask those kinds of questions, that kind of question. And ultimately then from those representations that I can see, or the information that's being processed in these ROIs or regions of interest, I can then infer how we might recognize scenes, or what can these then tell us about human scene processing. So that's the endeavor. So why do we have these? I'm not the only person to ask this, of course. Other people have asked why we might have this dedicated tissue. The general consensus right now, the big idea, is that you have all of these, or these 3 scene-selective regions, all in the service of navigation. So that's why you have these regions. So for example, face regions, people talk about us having them because we're social beings. Scene regions, people talk about them because we have to navigate and get around our world. Okay, so just to give you a little example of that, here is a place, a forest. And if I ask you to imagine standing here and walk about this forest or navigate this forest, you would make a right. You would then walk down the path, veering to the left, keeping the big tree, vertical thing, to the left and the bunch of bushes to your right. I can make one simple manipulation on this image, and the navigability, or how you're going to navigate that scene, is going to be very different. And that simple manipulation is just to mirror image flip it. Now I'm changing all of the left-right information, and now imagine standing here and you're going to navigate it completely differently. You're now going to go to the left, not the right, to get on the path. You're veering to the right, keeping the large vertical tree on the right and the bushes to the left. So it seems as though navigation then requires us to have sense information, or left-right information. You can probably see where I'm going here. So if it's true, then that all of these regions are in the service of navigation, or in a more cognitive way, that you've got scene recognition for navigation, then your scene representations will be sensitive to left-right information. You have to know whether something is to the left or right in order to navigate your environment. So I am going to go into these scene-selective regions, and I'm going to ask whether and how they represent left-right information. I did so using an fMRI adaptation paradigm. Many of you are familiar with this. For those of you who are not, I will quickly go over it while telling you how the experiment was designed. So while people were in the scanner, they were presented with pictures of scenes or places for 300 milliseconds. They, shortly thereafter, were presented with the identical image. I can then go into those ROIs, those regions of interest that were independently defined using a different set of data. And I can then look at the hemodynamic response, time, and percent signal change, if you will, or amount of activation in that region when that region or that individual is seeing repeat images of that place. In another trial, in that same individual, they were shown not the same, an identical pair, but an entirely different pair of images. For example, beach and forest. I can go within that same ROI and ask now how it responds to two different images. And there's the curve. And you can see that when the system is seeing these two different images, the response is much grander than that when it's seeing the same image. This is fMRI adaptation, sometimes called repetition suppression. Put very simply, if you will, it's neurons fatiguing. They're getting bored, seeing the same thing versus a novel thing. Okay, now, once we have that upper and lower bound, we can then ask, for example, as I did in this experiment, how does this region represent the mirror image flip? And this is what I'm going to use as the proxy for seeing if that region represents left and right information. So if the region sees the two images like this, and the curve looks like the same image, then this is said to be insensitive to left-right information. It's seeing these two images as the same. It doesn't care, if you will, if I can speak loosely, about left-right information. By contrast, if that mirror image hemodynamic response looks like the different curve, then it's seeing these two images as two different places and now is sensitive to left-right information. Clear? Okay. Left-right information, the assertion was left-right information is crucial for navigation. That means these regions should be representing left-right information in scenes and not left-right information on just anything. So in the same scan, we have objects. Okay, so what happens? The little brain up there, sorry, it's very small. We're here in the occipital place area. Again, we're asking whether these regions represent left or right, consistent with the idea that they're all involved in navigation. Time, percent signal change, you see a very beautiful hemodynamic response function here for the different, and the same. Different is, in fact, above the same, so the paradigm's working. We can ask now, where does mirror fall in relation to same and different? And it falls nearly on top of the different curve. Now, when we quantify that by taking the peak response, the top 2 peak response, the top 3 peak response, however we would like to do this, and I've done it in a number of ways, the answer remains the same. What we find is that the different and mirror are not significantly different from each other, but they are different from same. Remember, this was the criterion that we said that we were going to use to say that this region is sensitive to left-right orientation information. So that is more clearly put, or simply put, OPA is seeing these two places as two different places. So that is a check up there consistent with its role in navigation insofar as left-right information is crucial for that ability. RSC, the paradigm's working. What happens? The blue curve there, the mirror curve, is more like different. When we quantify that, we in fact find that's true. So like OPA, it is sensitive to left-right orientation information. It's seeing those two places as two different places, and that gets a check consistent with its suggested role in navigation as well. Okay, PPA. Paradigm's working, curve someplace in the middle, certainly not as nice as the others. The quantification in a number of ways gave us a very different pattern in that now the mirror and same were more similar than to each other, and they were different than different. So this is telling us that this region is in fact insensitive to the left-right orientation information. And so it is weirdly seeing these two places as the same place. So this starts to challenge that idea that these regions are all in the service of navigation, insofar as one does not even represent a piece of information that is relevant for you to get around your world. So here are the findings in a nutshell. In order for me to say, however, that OPA and RSC are sensitive while PPA is not, you must directly compare them. So a 3-by-3 condition interaction was significant. So now I can claim, indeed, that 2 are sensitive while the third is not. And I also had objects in there to show that the sensitivity is to left-right information in scenes and not just anything, and no ROI even adapted to the same versus different objects. So essentially the point is moot, asking how it did on the mirror flips. Question? Okay, so back to our very simple prediction. It cannot be that simple. And instead, we offered the following hypothesis. And it's based on at least this one study and the differential information processing across the different regions. They're not all about scene navigation. It's not a monolithic system. Instead, we offer the idea that we may have 2 systems for scene processing. One indeed involved in navigation, at least in the sense that it represents left-right information. So that is, for example, if you had to walk to that house, you would walk 100 feet. Okay, so what then is this region involved in? If it at least doesn't have one piece of navigationally relevant information, I'm going to broadly say it's involved in something called scene categorization, or it's the ability for you to recognize what kind of place or scene it is, so that this is, for example, a house and not a beach. I'm going to make the claim also that these are independent systems, so a strong, rather radical claim. Okay, so if this is true, this is one study and one piece of evidence, big deal. If this is true, that there are 2 systems for scene processing, then I should be able to see the same sort of information that's relevant for navigation here, just another kind, if you will, and categorization system would not have another kind of navigationally relevant information. Well, another kind of navigationally relevant information is egocentric distance. Not only do I have to make sure where something is to the right or left so I'm not smashing into it, I have to know how far or near it is so I'm not smashing into it as well in that dimension. So walking here is 100 feet to the house, walking here is 10 feet to the house. If I miscalculate, I'm either going to undershoot the house or I'm going to smash into the house. So the predictions are very easy. If RSC and OPA are involved in navigation, they would represent such egocentric distance information, while categorization would not. And this was also, we also included objects in there to make sure of the specificity. This was done by a graduate student, Andrew Persichetti. Is this being taped so we can show Andrew this picture that I showed? Okay. Sorry for the colors, guys. Again, different and same. This is the occipital place area again. The occipital place area, according to our hypothesis, is in the navigation system, or part of the navigation system. So it will also represent egocentric distance information, just like it represents left and right. So what happens here, paradigm's working, and the curve is certainly not as nice as it was in left and right, hanging out somewhere in between. We can quantify that, however, and again, in a number of different ways we quantify it. The answer remains the same. We have that different and distance are not different from each other, but more than the same. So OPA is indeed seeing these 2 places as different places. Okay, so we give a check that it seems to then, that's consistent with our idea that it's involved in navigation. RSC, paradigm's working. What happens? Hanging out someplace in between, quantification, different in distance, not different from each other, but different from same. So that region also sees those 2 places as 2 different places. Check, consistent with navigation. This was the killer. This is the region that did not represent left and right information. Will it represent egocentric distance information? No. So the distance curve is on top of the same curve. When we quantify that, that in fact is true. So PPA is not seeing these as different places. It's seeing it as the same place. It's seeing it as a house and not a kitchen or a beach. It doesn't care whether the house is near or far from you. So again, calling into question that this is a monolithic system all within navigation, all for navigation, and instead consistent with our two streams for scene processing hypothesis. When we directly compare, we have a significant interaction there, so thus I can claim that two regions represent such information while the third does not. And just to give you a flavor of how they look on objects, that's how they do on objects. So it's highly specific to distance information in pictures of images. Okay, you are maybe somewhat satisfied, but not fully, because I'm making big claims about this region being involved in categorization, and that's what I'm doing. I'm just making big claims. I'm asserting that. I can't use that it doesn't represent those necessarily to say exactly what it might be doing. So what kind of information might a recognition or a categorization system encode? Borrowing from the object literature, its shape, its relative length and angle. And in the scene world, we call this spatial layout. So just to give you a little sense of that, here are two toy rooms. And what I've done here, or what we've done here, is simply change the relative length and angle of the back wall. And we can see here that you would clearly not think that that's the same room. The spatial layout has changed. So we are going to, or rather did this very experiment, asking or predicting then that a categorization system or a recognition system, albeit in scenes, not objects, would represent length and angle information, while a navigation system needn't. And there are the object, there is the object control condition. Again, relative length and angle manipulation, and indeed matching exactly the back wall. Again, done by Flash Dancer. Okay, scenes. This is now PPA. This is the region that we thought that would represent the length and angle information. If indeed it's part of a categorization system, it does. OPA and RSC, the other two that we hypothesized to be part of a navigation system, needn't do that kind of information. However, contrary to our prediction, we found that OPA did. And I'll tell you what that means in a moment, while RSC did not. Now, that the interaction bears out that the two regions have length and angle information, while a third does not represent such information. And again, there is how those regions respond to objects. So it's specific to length and angle information in scenes, not objects. Okay, so our prediction here that the PPA represents length and angle is consistent with its role in categorization, but what was happening up here, where we had that differential information processing, we think that warrants a further bifurcation. Navigation, just like all of these regions aren't involved in navigation, some are, while others are not. Navigation is also not a monolithic system either. Navigation is not navigation is not navigation. There's many different kinds of navigation. So what kind of navigation might have egocentric distance information? All navigation systems must have that. But how about this visual information, this spatial layout or length and angle information? Well, we think that that would be something that we're going to call visually guided navigation. So not only when visually guided means getting around your immediately visible environment, me walking around here right now. So not only do I have to keep things to the left and right and calculate and compute how far something is, I have to calculate the size or shape of the things that I'm walking around. Boundaries, walls, floors, obstacles within the environment, desks, tables, and so on. And that's where we're getting that visual information, and then we can compute our relative distance and sense from that. So that's what we're calling our visually guided navigation system, a rather stupid system, just having that kind of information and getting around the world. By contrast, then, what would a navigation system be that has egocentric distance information but not immediately visible information? We call this memory-guided navigation or map-based navigation. Map-based navigation, many of you may have already heard of. This is kind of cognitive map idea. But this is having to navigate, for example, where you are. So you're in this room, and you could all, if I asked you right now to point to where your lab is, where your apartment is, your house, or whatever, that's not immediately in front of you. There's nothing to compute visually from that environment, and that's what we're going to call map-based navigation or memory-guided navigation, and we think RSC is involved in that. RSC is directly connected to hippocampus, which would make some big sense too. Questions? Yeah.
So this seems almost like for PPA a what processing story or something, because my initial reaction would be that navigable space, features that lead to navigable space versus some sort of obstruction would be a dimension to categorize along, and yet PPA in your data doesn't care about that.
Right.
So it's almost like object processing in a holistic manner.
That's right.
Not geometric processing as could be relevant to.
Yeah, indeed. So, so while we're talking about scenes here, I told you I also look at faces and objects, and I think that this action, what's your first name again? I'm sorry.
Thackeray?
Thackeray. We've met before, right?
I think so.
Okay, good. What Thackeray's referring to is that within object processing, there's also this claim that there are two systems. That there's an action system, me reaching out for this, versus me recognizing that it's a, what the hell is it called? Clicker? I don't know what it's called. Pointer, and not a cup. So this is very analogous to that. And what we're pushing now, or what we're investigating now, is that perhaps this action recognition system is a general organizing principle of higher level visual cortex, at least in inanimate stuff. Right? So you can see that even the anatomical position is pretty cool. Right? So it's thought, for the most part, that your recognition system in object processing is in the temporal lobe, and the dorsal and the action system is in parietal lobe, and these regions fall within those anatomical positions as well. The other claim that we have in this big thing where it might be general organizing, and people are saying, well, it's only in inanimate. I'm not sure that's true. I think there could be an action and recognition within face recognition too. Yeah? So what would be an action for face recognition? It's the dynamic sorts of information that you get. Emotion processing, social interaction, biological motion. These are all social stuff that is rather in action, if you will, motion. So I don't know exactly if action, broadly, it cuts across everything. But the idea is that this might be a general organizing principle of high-level visual stuff. It's a little tiny bit different than the object stuff, though, right? Because the object stuff, all the information is shared, in fact, across both streams. You just use it for different things, yeah? This is that you've got different information and you use it for different things. So it's not exactly beautifully mapped.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Do you think it matters that these subjects are seeing pictures that they know they're not going to go into the picture?
Yeah,
There's no
exactly.
action to take versus, when I actually know I might be navigating. Maybe that's a variant.
Yeah, totally. We're going to get to it, actually. But that's a great question, right? I did not ask these people to navigate, right? I did ask about the information that's necessary, right? So that's nice. But I didn't ask them to properly navigate. So here we go. Can I get outside of I planted Garrett in the audience. Can I get outside of information processing and ask about proper function? So ideally, I'd love to be able to put you into the scanner and have you actually navigate your immediately visible environment. But right now, we can't do that, right? Rats, maybe. But I don't know what an OPA and rat is yet. Okay, so at any rate, Can we look at the function proper? Well, in visually guided navigation, at least we can maybe make a little bit of a proxy for that. So if I, for example, or my graduate student walked around different environments with a GoPro or camera at eye level, so it is mimicking the actual navigation that you would take through the environment, what might these regions do with that? This was done by another graduate student, Freddie Camps. To give you a sense of those stimuli, again, Freddie walked around the university, taking pictures of different environments, him walking through, so the first person perspective motion, which is essentially a mimic of how you might do it or would do it. Faces in dynamic faces were a control. And the direct contrast for both of those dynamic bits of information, that is scenes or or faces, were to take that 3-second clip, chunk it into 1 3-second clips, and then scramble them. So it's all the same motion energy, if you will, but I disrupted the visually guided navigation. Okay, this is not a complicated analysis. It's not adaptation. It's nothing. It's straightforward, univariate. It's just asking within that region of interest, again, that was independently defined, on average, what's it due to these conditions? On the x-axis, we have the different regions of interest. On the y% signal change, this is how it responds to the dynamic scenes, the proxy for visually guided navigation, if you will, versus then when we disrupt the visually guided navigation. If OPA is indeed involved in visually guided navigation, then we would expect it to respond more to the dynamic scenes than the static scenes, and it did. RSC, memory-guided navigation or visually guided navigation, it shouldn't care much about it. It's going to respond because they're scenes, of course, yeah? But it shouldn't care much about it. It does not. And PPA likewise should not care much about it and does not. You might be saying, hang on, numerically at least, they're all responding more to dynamic than static. True. And that is because they're just a tad more exciting. And when we're paying more attention to a particular thing, bits of cortex all over are going to ramp up. So that's what that is. So crucially, we've got to show that there's an interaction with OPA responding disproportionately more to the motion information or dynamic scenes than the static scenes relative to either RSC or PPA, and that is true. If it's visually guided navigation, and this is a proxy for the motion through a scene, it better be for scene motion and not on any kind of motion. Maybe OPA, because of its anatomical location being toward the back of the brain and much more visual, if you will. Maybe it likes motion over not motion. So we've got a scene motion difference score. That's just the dynamic scenes minus the static scenes. And then here's how it does on the dynamic faces minus the static faces. And what you can see is that OPA cares only for scene motion, does not respond to even above baseline on the face motion. Okay, now you could also say, well, looking at those scenes and those faces, they have very different kinds of motion. And how do I know that this is really scene motion? That it's liking, or not just maybe some more motion here or a different kind of motion than in the faces? Well, I can ask the cortex to tell me that because I did not control for motion. I can ask the cortex and I can go into a region that's called MT. MT is a motion-sensitive region in cortex that responds to lots of kind of motion, even imagined motion. It likes motion. So if it's true that this is just it's responding here for attentional reasons, or it likes that kind of motion over that kind of motion, then MT would show the same pattern, and then I'm kind of stuck. So you can imagine that's not what happened. In fact, MT did not see these two as different, but at least numerically saw face motion as more interesting and more exciting than scene motion, the complete opposite pattern than I see in OPA. So from that experiment, going after, again, at least somewhat more the function proper. You're still not visually navigating through something when you're in the scanner, right? But at least as far as the proxy, that proxy we have, we can say that those results are consistent with that idea. Okay, now one more. The next experiment directly pitted visually guided navigation and categorization. So if it's true that there are two systems, I should be able to selectively modulate these systems by task demand. So PPA should respond more when you're categorizing a scene, recognizing it, than when you're navigating it, and vice versa for OPA. And that's exactly what Andrew did next. While you're in the scanner or one is in a scanner, they see a picture, one picture at a time. They're asked to fixate, and in some trials, they're asked to categorize that scene. So to tell Andrew using a 3 AFC, whether it's, for example, a kitchen, no, this is a kitchen, a bedroom, and a living room. Yeah, again, one at a time. That same person on that same image, just in a different trial, had to do a navigation, a visually guided navigation task, and that is to stand here and imagine that they're going to walk down the continuous path and which door they could leave through as a consequence. So here you could see that you have to walk here and go out the left. There's breaks in all other places to get to the right. Here the answer would be center door, and here again the 3 AFC would be right. Yeah? Okay. Exact same images, the behavior from an independent group as well as those in the scanner. They were matched across tasks. People were 85% correct here and 85% correct here, and there were no differences in eye movements while they were in the scanner. Okay, so any differences I find between these two tasks then in cortex, I can relate to the task and it not having to do with low-level visual property differences between the two images, for difficulty or for eye movements. Again, different ROIs, percent signal change, PPA thought to be involved in categorization and not navigation. Will it be selectively modulated by the categorization task or when the person is doing categorization and not navigation? Yes. OPA should give us the exact opposite pattern. If it's involved in navigation and not categorization, true. And RSC doesn't care about either categorization or visually guided navigation, so it shouldn't care about either of the tasks, and it does not. Now, you should all be freaking out a bit. There's an interaction here, so we have a nice double dissociation. However, I told you in the beginning I was making the radical claim that these systems are independent. How the hell do you do that when there's a huge response for the non-preferred task, if you will? So what is going on there? How could I dare say that this is involved in categorization and not navigation and vice versa? Well, these are scene-selective regions. They look at scene, when they see scenes, they respond. So might this just be a response as if that region is just seeing the scene and it not caring about the task proper? So Andrew brought back a subset of people, gave them the 3 tasks again, and on the proper baseline task, if you will, how that region responds when it just is looking at a scene was to respond whether the current image is just simply the same or different than the previous image. No categorization, no navigation, nothing, but just looking at the scene and perhaps even feature matching. Okay, so again, all the controls are taken care of. What happens? Well, we get the same response here, replicating. So cat, not nav, nav, not cat. But again, the crucial thing was that what happens on when these regions are just seeing the scene, well, it looks just like when on the non-preferred task. So this, in fact, is just PPA seeing a scene, and this response is for categorization. In OPA, this is seeing the scene, looks just like its non-preferred task. So now I can conclude that the interaction and can conclude that PPA is involved in categorization and not navigation, while OPA is involved in navigation and not categorization. Okay. However, last bit, fMRI data are correlational. You all know this. And thus, it could be the case that any such information representation is merely epiphenomenal. So do we have any causal evidence? Well, we just got done testing a bunch of individuals with Williams syndrome. Williams syndrome is a developmental disorder, a genetic deficit. why they're important to us, or this experiment at least, is that, and Freddie did this, is that Williams syndrome have cortical thinning in and around occipital place area. So now if we put them through the same task that I just went over, the categorization and navigation task on the exact same images, and OPA is involved in navigation, not categorization, they should do poorly on the navigation task and do well on the categorization task, and that's exactly what happens. So here's the navigation task. This is accuracy. They're above chance, so they can do it. They're just not doing it well. This is how they do on categorization. These are mental age matched controls. Williams syndrome have an average IQ of about 80. So we've got to make sure that it's not something to do with just IQ. So when you mental age and sex match them, what we can see here is that they look nothing like the mental age match controls with respect to navigation, but they certainly do with respect to navigation. So a nice double dissociation, causal double dissociation in this case. Last bit. I am going to, in you, and this goes back to Garrett's question, I want to be able to really show this in when you're doing a task for real, walking around the environment. So we can TMS, or zap OPA, the technical term. We can zap OPA, virtually lesioning that area, if you will. We can argue what it means, yeah? While a person then is actually doing a visually guided navigation task. And in this case, it's a reorientation task with the prediction, obviously, that they're going to be impaired on the visually guided navigation task and not a control task in that same room. And last but not least, we're getting ready to test stroke patients because I can't zap RSC and PPA because they're too deep in the cortex, but we're getting ready to test some patients with especially PPA damage, and we'll get the complete double dissociation between 2 and 3. So these are all the people that I'd like to thank, and I thank you, of course, as well, and with that, I will take questions.
Excellent. Questions for Daniel?
Is there any evidence of lateralization across the two hemispheres?
No, not yet. I don't see any. Some people have claimed, Eleanor McGuire claims that there might be some left stuff going on. Other people say right. I don't find any kind of lateralization yet. Nor sex differences either, which could be kind of interesting with the spatial navigation stuff, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious how you think about like the design of your controls to sort of match for visual, like low-level visual features that are present across the different stimuli. I can imagine, for example, that like, I mean, so a lot of scenes have sort of vertical cues more on the peripheral.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
Yeah.
But then, for example, that's a visual feature that's changing egocentric distance to an object.
Yep.
To an object.
Exactly.
So you're changing actually like high-level visual features while also changing like the sort of abstract sense of like what is the actual distance.
That's right.
Like how do you think about that?
Yeah. Hard and long, I think about it. It's a thing, right? Because scenes are scenes because they're visually different than faces and objects, right? There's nothing around that, right? If I start morphing a scene into a face, it becomes a face, right? But I'm changing particular properties. So what we do is we end up looking at other bits of cortex, yeah? So you can go into early vision, and you can show that early vision does not look like the pattern that you see, for example, in scene regions. And you know that if there are low-level visual differences, this V1's telling you that, and PPA is not responding like that. So that's typically how we get out of those sorts of things, yeah? The other sorts of things, why are you grimacing? Of course, that's how you, oh. I was like, what's wrong with that? The other way is to try to match as much as you can, right? So you can try to match spatial frequencies. Right? You can, or again, you look at spatial frequencies and make sure that it doesn't match the pattern. But yeah, it's a big concern. Yeah. What would you predict? Why is that interesting? Yeah, good. So it's a manipulation for navigation, sure. if I didn't get, we can certainly try it, right? But if we didn't get that, I'd be terribly surprised, right? That would be like me asking you to close your eyes, right? And of course, if you can't see something, right, you're not going to be able to navigate it. But would you get a differential between categorization and navigation if you can't see it? I don't think so, right?
I wouldn't say a line is going to be dark. It's not like showing you a dark image. It's just a dark screen.
Good. Yeah. So we could degrade it. That's true. That's fun, right? So maybe we could show behaviorally, right, that it takes a certain amount of degradation for you to crash the navigation system, and another amount for you to crash the categorization. Very fun. Very fun. So there's also something well known called a face inversion. So we're always searching for behavioral stuff too, right? Behavioral stuff is as cool, if not cooler, than imaging, by the way. Okay. So So there's a well-known thing called face inversion effect, which you all know, I'm sure. When you turn a face upside down, you are really, really, really bad at recognizing as opposed to upright. And of course, these are faces that you can recognize. For example, Brad Pitt or something, right? You're substantially slower. Now, Yin talked about this in 1969 in his dissertation at MIT, finding this thing and saying that faces are special because if I turn objects upside down, for example, you don't crash. You don't have a problem recognizing the Eiffel Tower upside down. You don't have a problem recognizing a cup upside down. You only have a problem recognizing faces. So a nice cognitive signature to say faces are different than other stuff. Okay, now, what we had just recently done is, and people use scenes for sure, yeah? So what we've done, however, is we tried to see, go to your, what's your name? Say? Orally. What Orly's talking about with that degradation, what we did was if you flip a scene upside down, guys, you can't navigate it. Right? So what we are finding now is a navigation inversion effect, but not a scene categorization inversion effect. So you can still recognize the bedroom upside down, you just are bad at navigating around it. So it's the same sort of thing. If you can rip these apart behaviorally as well, in addition to neurally, it's just converging evidence. It's even more beautiful.
I know people have to have
Yeah.
their class.
Thank you, guys. Sorry for keeping you late.
Fine. Thank Danny once again.